So this is a real quick review of the demo I gave in class about getting up and running in Playmaker and using Playmaker to take control of the ball in the Gravitylab project. So again, just a real quick review of the process of getting Playmaker up and running. At this point, I've already have Playmaker installed. If you purchase this through the asset store, you can download through the asset store. Just log in. And once you log in, you can go to your downloads tab, and from download, you'll find Playmaker listed. You'll need to download and then import. And once you go through the import process, you should have a Playmaker menu in the system menu of Unity. So once I have Playmaker up and running, what I need to do is I want to look at two Playmaker panels. And the first panel is the editor window, Playmaker editor. I'll close a little splash screen here, and what I like to do is I like to take the Playmaker editor and nest that just to the right of my assets, and I'll move the Playmaker editor over a little bit so I get more focus on the Playmaker editor window. The other panel that I like to see is the, where is it? Playmaker, editor window, action browser. There it is. So Playmaker, editor windows, action browser. With the action browser open, I'll just grab the tab and I'm going to nest that to the right of the inspector. And I'll give that a little bit more room. So we'll take a deep dive into Playmaker during our next class, but this is just a quick reminder of the procedure to get Playmaker up and running, at least to control the sphere and the Gravitylab. So the first step is that I do have my sphere selected. And it's important to remember that I've already applied a rigid body to this object. If you haven't done that already, you can go to Components, Physics, Rigid Body. And at that point, when you run your simulation, your sphere should drop in the scene. It's being controlled then by the physics engine inside Unity. Now, to get Playmaker up and running with the sphere selected, what I need to do is go into the Playmaker editor window and right-click, and I need to add an FSM. Once I have a state machine, I have state 1, and I'll let the name of the state default. But what I'm looking to do is I'm looking to translate some user input. So I'm going to go to the Actions tab. I'm going to find Input, and I'm specifically looking for a Get Access Vector. So I'll double click on Get Access Vector. That loads the Get Access Vector action to state 1. And so what the Get Access Vector is looking for is it's looking for the horizontal and vertical user input, which is the AWSD keys or the arrow keys, and that's mapped directly in Unity. And it's going to translate that and store that in a vector variable. Now, remember, what we're basically doing is we're getting some user input, we're storing that in a vector variable that we can then transfer that variable information over to an add force. So the idea is that we're going to record or capture the input of the vertical and horizontal input from the user, and we're going to translate that to a force, which will allow us to push our marble or our ball around screen. So I've added my get access vector. The next step is I need to create a variable. So I'm going to go to the variables tab. I'm going to go where it says new variable, and I'll just say, I'll call this player movement. And under variable type, I want to select that drop down menu, and it's specifically looking for a vector 3. So I'll choose vector 3 and I'll hit the add button. So I now have this player movement. It's a vector 3 variable. And now if I go back over to my state where it says store vector in the get access vector, we can click on this little drop down menu and choose player movement. If you create a variable and it's not listed in this drop down menu, or any drop down menu for that matter, it means that you've created the wrong kind of variable. So in other words, just as a test, what I'll do is I'll deselect the player movement vector 3. I'll create a test variable and I'll set that to float, and I'll add. So now I have two variables. The player movement is a vector 3, the test is a float. I'll go back to my original state in the get access vector, and I'm looking for the store vector. You can see when I click on this drop down menu, the only value that's available is the player movement, because that's the only qualified variable, which is a vector 3. Now I'm seeing the results of this variable because I have my debug turned on, and I'd recommend that you click this little debug checkbox because that'll give you some real-time feedback about the variables. So right now I simply have a get axis variable, and what that's looking for is the horizontal and vertical axis. And so when I hit the play button, nothing's going to happen except that when I use the AWSD keys, you can see that these values start to move around. Okay, so you can see they bump up to 1, -1. Okay, so it's starting to track the user input. Now what I want to do, I'll go back to my state, is I want to translate that vector 3 to an add force. So I'm going to go into the action browser and I'm looking for physics, and I'll just do a simple add force and I'll double click. So in the add force action, what I'm looking for is that there's the ability to apply force at a vector 3 coordinate system. And what we'll do is in that drop down menu, we'll use that same player movement. So in this first action, we're recording the user input. We're storing that in this vector 3 player movement. And then later, we'll use the add force action to pick up the player movement input and translate that to an axis. And so currently, we're mapping our axes, our horizontal and vertical axes, we're mapping that to the X and the Z planes. So X in this case is left and right, and Z is forward backwards. And so we'll get a little bit of force that's being applied here, but we're only going to apply a force value of 1. So we're not going to see real dramatic results here. In fact, I can barely see any results, and there's a couple reasons for that. I'll go back into state 1. If I scroll down, I want to add force according to the vector 3, but I also want to do this every frame. So down here at the bottom of the action, there's an every frame, and I want to make sure that that's checked. So as long as I'm holding down one of the axes keys, so AWSD or the arrow keys, every frame that I hold that down, it will apply a force. I'm going to bump up the multiplier in the get axis, and what that will do, you'll notice, is that instead of translating the scale of the horizontal and vertical axis to 1, if we bump this up to, let's say, 20, it'll translate that variable, instead of a scale of 0 to 1, it'll go from 0 to 20. So now when I hit the play button and I use the AWSD keys, you can see that I'm starting to steer my sphere or my ball around. Okay, and I have that mapped to the XZ, so when I use the W and S keys, it becomes forward backwards based on my camera orientation. And so there, I have some quick controls over my falling sphere in Playmaker. And we'll take a deeper dive into Playmaker during the next class. But if you have any questions, you can post questions in the discussion board. And we'll catch up in class.